Is alchemy really a secret science or just a myth for initiates?
Alchemy is a myth and a pseudoscience for all those who do not have access to it. It's the most dangerous path because it can cost us decades if we are on the wrong track and just experiment in order to quickly create gold out of greed. Alchemy is the royal discipline and the most secret discipline of all spiritual paths, of all authentic spiritual paths. And it is the best guarded system of evolution. And why does it need to be protected? Because people, when they are not yet fully ready, often tend to unintentionally harm themselves or others. That means you need gradual change, careful ethical refinement, and inner purity so that this important transformation can truly take place from a heavy, deeply matter-bound and self-centered ego to a fully liberated, radiant, sun-like, and sustaining principle of being.
The common question that many people ask is alchemy really a secret science or just a myth for initiates?
That's actually an interesting question because it already touches on the fundamental misconceptions about alchemy. In fact, first of all, let me give a very brief introduction to the topic. Alchemy is one of those spiritual sciences about which very few people report, or are even able to report. There are a few who have published books on alchemical writings, historical books, but in the present day, we do not find many texts on the subject, and certainly not spiritual teachers. We find some references in Eastern teachings or from Eastern gurus who primarily describe certain processes from the Vedic tradition concerning the body on the spiritual path and the various energy centers and mechanisms within the body. But in the West, we search more or less in vain if we are looking for such teachings. So yes, in a way, alchemy is indeed a myth, because most of what we learn about alchemy in, let's use this provocative term, the mainstream media, comes from novels and movies meant for entertainment about wizards, schools, and the like, but not about this real science, this spiritual teaching of alchemy. Because alchemy is not just a science, but it also has its own language, like every science. If we study Kabbalah, then we have to deal with Kabbalistic terms, mostly Aramaic or Hebrew terms, and learn quite a bit here. If we engage with Hermeticism, there are Hermetic symbols and terms. And so in all spiritual virtues or in all spiritual disciplines, we find different languages, symbolic languages. And alchemy uses one of the most deceptive and mysterious languages, because to the untrained eye, it appears to be a chemical process taking place in a laboratory somewhere in a dark, shadowy basement, where some old white-haired man is painstakingly trying to create a treasure from some stones or lead, or to find a tincture of eternal life. So this is a myth, and in reality, alchemy is much more than that and has nothing at all to do in the external sense with someone experimenting in an external laboratory. That is chemistry. Alchemy is a true secret doctrine because most of what has been published about alchemy is in fact not applicable for the average person. That means there are books about alchemy that describe various fascinating processes, mysterious symbols, different stages, important works, a range of metals, special tinctures, and sometimes even detailed instructions, all in remarkable detail. But anyone who tries to carefully follow something directly from a book would likely be tempted to practice it step by step, as if they were working in a chemistry lab. And that is precisely not what alchemy is. Today, we will delve into the inner teachings of alchemy, at least as far as the areas that are intended for the public. And those who are familiar with our YouTube videos know that we publish different levels of wisdom. There is wisdom for the public, the spiritual laws. Then there is that for spiritual students who are in an authentic spiritual training. And then there is that for initiates. That means we do not address these last two aspects. But we do address the spiritual laws behind it, and today we will bring a bit of clarity to this mysterious subject of alchemy. So, for many people, alchemy is an unreal pseudoscience, and that's a good thing. But you could say the same thing about the science of symbols. For example, if we were to ask any random person on the street about a symbolic system, like the tarot keys, the first answer would probably be, yeah, that's a fortune-telling system. Fortune tellers, gypsies and witches, some crystal balls, and predicting the future. But actually, it's a symbolic system. It has nothing to do with all those things I just mentioned. And it's the same with alchemy. That is, how do you most easily conceal a powerful, one of the strongest methods of spiritual transformation? By openly publishing this teaching in the form of symbols, so that those individuals who have the proper training, the necessary education, and the required knowledge can actually decipher and interpret these symbols. That means the simpler and more straightforward certain terms may appear on the surface, the more they actually conceal and hide beneath their apparent simplicity. And the more obscure they seem, the more clearly they convey the truth. And this is exactly the paradox that we also encounter in alchemy, because alchemy is the only science that deals with this, whether in the East, in the West, or in the Chinese teachings of alchemy. So alchemy is indeed a broad field. It doesn't exist only in Central Europe, but in almost all authentic spiritual paths. At their core, there is a path of alchemy. Because alchemy describes the processes that occur during spiritual transformation. Not just the mental ones that we experience, but also the physical ones. That means when a spiritual tradition speaks of enlightenment, there are underlying processes that constitute enlightenment. So enlightenment is not just a term, but something actually happens in human consciousness. A change takes place, a different kind of perception. And all these changes that occur on the mental level also take place on the physical level. And alchemy is the teaching that preserves all these processes. That means for thousands of years, it has been observed, verified, and recorded which processes occur on the spiritual path, or even further, on the path of human evolution. And not just human evolution, but evolution as a whole. That is the evolution of individuality, the awakening of consciousness or of mass consciousness. So the entire course of evolution can be found in the language of alchemy, that is in symbols and in what happens when we change. This means that from an alchemical perspective, no one can pretend to be enlightened or to have experienced some kind of evolution. Because evolution is accompanied by certain mental and physical changes. What physical changes? The composition of the blood must change, certain neural connections in the brain must be made, and certain areas in the brain must be activated. Step by step, current external science is steadily advancing in its research, because it now has more and more sophisticated tools and is increasingly daring to venture forth into these complex areas, and is thus reaching certain points and fields where it can, at least in part, recognize or verify these subtle and important differences. But alchemists have been doing this for thousands of years. That means they have a head start of thousands of years in terms of information. They observe generations of development and pass on these mechanisms in a symbolic language. That means you could almost say that alchemy is the royal discipline and the most secret discipline of all spiritual paths, of all authentic spiritual paths. And it is the best guarded system of evolution. And why does it need to be protected? Because people, when they are not yet fully ready, often tend to unintentionally harm themselves or others. That means you need gradual change, careful ethical refinement, and inner purity, so that this important transformation can truly take place. Otherwise, and this is the flip side of alchemy, we can lose ourselves in even greater labyrinths of error, in even more darkness, in even more illusions. Because then we are tempted to experiment in a laboratory without recognizing the true spiritual path. That means we end up materialistically following some instructions that were never meant for that purpose, and think we are alchemists. And this is also the great mistake, to believe that alchemy is something like a cookbook. That is, I take these ingredients from the East and then this or that will happen. That would only be correct if it were not a symbolic language. That means the salt of alchemy is not the salt that a cook uses. The mercury of alchemy, or quicksilver, is not exactly the same as the external volatile metal that chemists use. Sulfur, or the sulfur of alchemy, is something entirely different from the materialized sulfur we find on the outermost level, which some people, for example, use for sulfur baths. So that means we're dealing with symbols here, and we will take a closer look at them during the course of today's retreat. So that was a brief introduction. And once again, in a few sentences, alchemy is a myth and a pseudoscience for all those who do not have access to it. It's the most dangerous path because it can cost us decades if we are on the wrong track and just experiment in order to quickly create gold out of greed, to seek external gold or some elixir of eternal life, or to look for a philosopher's stone somewhere in the East. But at the same time, this very discipline can show us a way of how evolution truly works in a lasting way.
Following up on that, as was briefly mentioned, the transformation of lead into gold. So is it really possible to transform physical matter with alchemy? Or is this transformation of lead into gold just a metaphor?
So lead into gold, just to clarify briefly, this is a classic example. Alchemy illustrates not only processes of transformation, but also serves as a symbolic system to help explain the mysteries of creation and change to us, offering insight into how things can be fundamentally altered. That means, how does creation work? How does the act of creating work? How does it work to be a creature? How can a creature be elevated to the next stage of evolution? And metaphorically, you could also say, if lead has the lowest vibration of the 7 alchemical metals and stands for sluggish, ignorant darkness, and gold represents the highest perfection of the metal or metals, and stands for spiritual awakening or for the light, that is, from darkness to light. In other words, a true transformation, a profound change. And to transmute this lead, a creature, so that it becomes gold. So that is the process of alchemy. What does that mean, for example, in our lives? On the lowest level, simply as a human being, for example, we have a situation full of conflict. It could be challenges at work, on the financial level, in a relationship, partnership, health, or something similar. Then we set a goal, namely, if it's on the professional level, a new job in such and such a field. We set this goal, and if we are persistent, take the necessary steps, and this goal is strong enough, filled with enough emotion and clear imagination, and we know exactly where the journey is supposed to take us, and we clear all obstacles out of the way. We are gradually drawn to this goal like a magnet until it is realized, and, for example, we have a new job in which we can express more fulfillment or something similar. That is alchemy. We have changed the world. We have changed our individual world. We have transformed a situation to the next level into a situation that suits us better, that is more fulfilling for us. So this is the lowest level of alchemy. And we see that this happened through a conscious act of will. That means setting a goal is an act of will. Here we also see how important goal setting, willpower, and similar qualities are. On another level, this lead into gold transformation also corresponds on the spiritual path to raising the lead of ignorance, the unconscious within us, that is the unrecognized, the dark aspects, into the light, transforming and refining them. On the one hand, the lead then symbolizes the very lowest aspect of our ego, and the gold, in contrast, a higher aspect of the highest and true self. And this is the profound transformation that takes place from a heavy, deeply matter-bound and self-centered ego to a fully liberated, radiant, sun-like and sustaining principle of being. That is, on the spiritual level, or to use another term, the first stage of enlightenment. We might come back to these stages later at a more appropriate time when we discuss the phases of the work. The external science, let's call it exoteric science, including chemistry, physics, and other related scientific disciplines, also endeavors to transform metals as well. And yes, it is possible to transform metals on this level as well, but it requires an enormous effort from external science, and financially, it is not profitable to make any changes here. But when we talk about this transformation in alchemy from lead to gold, something entirely different is meant. What is meant is a stage of evolution within the human being himself. That is, within the human vehicle, in the human environment, which includes the material world, but also the inner world of the person, changes take place. Transformations occur there. Areas undergo change. It's the same as when we want to achieve a goal. In order for us to reach this new goal, for example, having a new job, we need to let go of the old job. If we want to attain a new profession, we have to let go of the old one, or let go of our old life. And this is also one of the principles of alchemy, solve et coagula, but we will go into that later. That means we have to let go of the old so that we can reach the new, and then attach ourselves to the new. And these processes of change are presented to us in the archaea. They are also given to us through symbols. The archive is a rich symbol system, and for every mini aspect in life. And at the stage of transformation, there are specific symbols that explain this precisely. For example, lead symbolizes this immature state of a person, full of burdens and limitations. And wood, of course, stands for the refinement of consciousness, enlightenment, the commodity itself. And there are also stages to this, how we actually undergo this transformation. In the archaea, there is the small, the large, and the highest work in three colors: the black work of alchemy, the white work of alchemy, and the red work of alchemy. That means there are stages on the spiritual path, and each stage completes a system. For example, in the lesser work, the personality structure is completely transformed, balanced, harmonized, and elevated so that it is ready for a higher experience of perception, namely a state of permanent readiness. It is not about a small spark of light, a small recognition, a small awakening and flickering into reality, but in the archaea, it is about stabilizing a stage of evolution. That means integrating the experience of the next evolutionary stage of humanity, having a higher consciousness into the here and now. This means, however, that we also need a vehicle in which this is possible. A personality through which we can express this higher knowledge, this higher consciousness. And here we also see how alchemy differs from many pseudo-esoteric paths that want to sell us some kind of quick success. Because in alchemy, we are talking about evolution, about a stage of evolution, about the next level of spiritual evolution. It is not just a brief realization of a higher state of consciousness during meditation, but rather the permanent expression of the next level of consciousness. That means the small self, the ego, is transcended, and the true self is used as an individual, as a tool to express itself. Of course, that is not the end. Then the journey continues. Over the course of many centuries, the body of knowledge in this highest of all disciplines was not made available all at once, but rather emerged slowly, bit by bit. Often, only fragments of this wisdom were published at different times, sometimes separated by years or even generations. These pieces of knowledge were carefully collected and preserved, and on occasion they were compiled into valuable books. Such books, though rarely complete, offered at least a partial window into the subject and were highly prized by those who had a deep interest in exploring these profound ideas. Access to these works was generally limited, and only individuals with a true affinity for seeking out and understanding this discipline would go to great lengths to find them. In this way, the knowledge was gradually shared, always in part and always cherished by those who valued the pursuit of the highest intellectual achievements. But as mentioned, as long as a system is conveyed in a language rich in symbols, an ordinary person cannot understand these symbols. And so he will always be inclined to misinterpret these symbols. And that's not just a mess, but it's also one of the reasons why alchemy should never be explored outside of a spiritual or an authentic spiritual training. Because it's comparable to being in elementary school, in primary school, where we first begin to learn the very first aspects of mathematics, that is, learning to add and subtract, to perform these fundamental operations, and getting the very foundational basics of mathematics, the essential building blocks that everything else is built upon. And then someone gives us a book about higher mathematics. Yes, for an elementary school student, things like extracting roots, cutting planes, and the like. It's obvious then that this child, who is just taking their first steps in mathematics, can't do anything with that. They simply lack the mental capacity to take it in. And so even as children, in order to explore small areas of mathematics, we need years to develop the willingness, the ability, and the capacity to engage with it. Well, and that goes double for alchemy on the spiritual path. And alchemy does not work against the laws of nature. It is always a misconception to think that we would somehow override natural laws. No. Alchemy uses the knowledge of the laws of nature or also the spiritual laws of creation. This means that not all the laws of creation are currently known to the external world. Some of these laws are known to external science and it has access to them, but alchemy does not dissolve these laws. It uses these laws, and that's another misconception, to think that through spirituality one could dissolve any laws. No, we consciously use these laws, and by applying them consciously, we can bring about changes that to an outsider may seem like miracles, changes that others cannot consciously achieve in this way.
A common term or symbol that you often encounter when dealing with alchemy is the Philosopher's Stone, which was briefly mentioned earlier. What is behind the search for the Philosopher's Stone?
Well, the Philosopher's Stone is considered one of the goals of alchemy. It stands for complete transformation. In Latin, lapis philosophorum. The stone is described in many fairy tales and myths. But as I said, these are fairy tales and myths. And yes, the stone is also, of course, a physical object, an actual, tangible, material one, so that a true and meaningful spiritual transformation can indeed take place. And this stone is not outside of the person, but within the person themselves. That means it is a change that a person experiences, and then a transformation takes place within the person themselves. And we don't want to go into detail now about what kinds of transformations take place internally. But it's worth briefly mentioning what is connected to this. On the one hand, the Philosopher's Stone is a goal of alchemical work. On the other hand, it is the ultimate means for the perfection of matter and spirit. That is, without the Philosopher's Stone, higher consciousness is not possible, at least not permanently. In the Hermetic tradition, it is the highest form of consciousness transformation, but also of refinement. And it is the result of the great work of alchemy. That is to say, there is the lesser work of alchemy, the great work, and the highest work. And in the great work of alchemy, these are then the stages of enlightenment. The lesser work is the refinement of the personality structure according to the four elements. In the great work are the stages of enlightenment, and in the highest work is the completion, the crowning of material creation. And this is based, as we have already discussed recently, on the gradual purification of three aspects: sulfur, mercury, salt. In Latin, that is sulfur, mercury, and salt. In Latin, we can also say sulfur, mercurius, and salt. In more modern terms, these three aspects represent the three aspects of the human being: self-consciousness, superconsciousness, and subconsciousness. That means it requires a gradual purification of the self-consciousness, superconsciousness, and subconsciousness of the human being. Yes, all of this may sound very theoretical or depth psychological right now, but in reality, it means that if we imagine this as a triangle, that we are in the right balance, recognize the forces of self-consciousness and no longer try to identify them with the intellect, perceive the forces of the superconsciousness, and explore the laws upon which our subconsciousness rests. After all, the subconscious is responsible for many areas in life. It's not just that the cells of our body are held together and form this body, or that our heartbeat or other automatic functions, or even our ability to speak a language exist. All of this is connected to the subconscious, and knowing these laws means also learning how to use them. And in alchemy, there are various areas that can be divided into main aspects. The three principles that were explained earlier, namely sulfur, mercury, and salt. Then there are the four elements. Most people have already heard of the four elements. You can find this both in the East and in the West. There is earth, then air, then water, and then fire. But on the outermost level, we must not confuse this exclusively with the external elements. That means don't think that Earth is just the soil we walk on. There's much more hidden behind it. Because our personality, not just our body, our personality is also made up of these four elements. And everything in this cosmos can be traced back to these elements and to the interaction of these elements, but also to these three principles. And then there is something else, namely the seven metals, the seven ancient metals, or rather the seven metals that are associated with the seven ancient planets. So the metals, which you've already heard about in food, such as iron and silver, gold, lead, tin, and so on. And then there are the 12 stages of alchemy, or the 12 phases. These are the individual steps, and this was explained briefly earlier. How does evolution happen? And in the 12 stages, we can see which stage of change is taking place. That means it's a very clear map. How does transformation occur? How does change happen? And the Philosopher's Stone is a principle of perfection. And that means it manifests both in matter, that is, on the material level, as well as in our consciousness. In other words, this is an interaction that takes place equally on both levels. And it is connected. Now we come to another principle, to the quintessence, the fifth element. It is also called iter. And this fifth element, this spiritual principle, stands above the four elements and governs these four elements. As a symbol, one could also say a pentagram with one point facing upward. The point facing upward represents this spiritual principle which rules over the four elements, that is, the other points. So it is a powerful symbol of alchemy. And only through the complete harmonization of these four elements is it possible to create the Philosopher's Stone. And we could now imagine the Philosopher's Stone like this, though this doesn't correspond to how it actually is. But for example, if we have a prism and light shines through it, then this prism splits the light like a rainbow into its different colors. And that's how the Philosopher's Stone works within the human vehicle as well. The stream of consciousness flows through this stone and enables a new permanent perspective on reality. It's as if all of a sudden we have for example, most people have their senses, and their physical senses can hear, see, smell, and so on. And then there is another sense, and this additional sense holds the result of the Philosopher's Stone. Without this Philosopher's Stone, we do not have this additional sense permanently. This is a higher level of perception, not the ordinary perception where we know the observer and so on, but a higher stage. That is, this is cosmic consciousness. This cosmic consciousness does not mean I am in the body and experience the world through my body, but rather the body is within me. So this is the transformation of consciousness that takes place, and it is not something like a sudden aha moment that just comes and goes. Rather, this experience is permanent. That means we have a new sense. When we learn to see, when our eyes are opened, then we see. And as long as we are able to see, this sense remains active.
What does the famous formula solve et coagula mean, and how can it be applied in personal development?
Solve et coagula is Latin and means to dissolve and to bind, to break down and to unite. This is one of the central principles of alchemy and describes a process of transformation, dissolving and reshaping. As I explained earlier with the example, we first have to let go of the old in order to be able to reach the new. We cannot enter a new space if we do not leave the old one. And that is the great challenge on the spiritual path. Some people think, now I am ready for a spiritual path and for change and so on, but then they want everything to stay the same as before, for their life to remain unchanged, yet they want to walk the spiritual path. But that simply doesn't work. That means in order for us to experience something new, to change, we have to let go of the old. It sounds so simple and so logical, yet in reality, for most people, it is not doable. They refuse to make this change, to let go of the old, to let go of all their old patterns, to let go of their old identity, to let go of their old life, to let go of their old life story and story of suffering. Instead, they go out to everyone and constantly tell their old story of suffering, their old past, their old wounds, their old hurts, their old pains, their hatred, and they keep reviving their so-called I story, that is the old, and they are not ready for a spiritual path. That means the spiritual path is solve and coagula. We have to let go of the old, destroy it, to create space for the new, and we bind the new. So this dissolution means breaking down and purifying. Purification is a term in alchemy for substances or structures of consciousness. So this may sound a bit abstract in alchemy, but this dissolving and breaking down happens at the first stage on the level of personality. That means not just doing things on the external material level, but starting with ourselves first. That is also what defines the spiritual path. Not focusing on any external appearances, but first on ourselves and the interaction and the realization. How do we react in life so that we can finally take the next step, namely to act instead of just react? Coagula means to connect. It describes the reuniting on a higher level, like in the example of a profession. We let go of the old job in order to take on a new one and start a new career. But the fact is, it is still, in quotation marks, the concept of a profession that is on a higher level. Next goal, a higher level. It is still a profession. Old job let go, new job started. That means bringing things back together on a higher level. And this process is reflected both in nature, in creation, in all alchemical processes, and of course also on the spiritual path. And again, this process of solve and coagula is repeatedly and consistently associated with various terms, such as the seven metals, the different phases, and so on. That means this is a universal principle that we will encounter again and again as soon as we embark on the alchemical path. For example, let's take the seven metals of the Archimedeans. It's not a coincidence that there are seven metals, just as there are 7 days of the week, 7 energy centers, 7 chakras, and 7 ancient planets. These are all symbols, not for the same thing, but for similar aspects of life. And in this way, these 7 metals also correspond to the 7 energy centers of the body. And for this energy, for example, to flow from one energy center, that is one chakra, to the next, or to be elevated, it is also necessary for solve and coagula to take place there. Because the patterns that are present in an energy center and bind the energy there must be dissolved. That may sound very abstract, but for example, if the Kundalini energy lies in the metal lead, which is at the deepest material level, then we have to let go of our material attachments. Greed, bondage, the false perception of reality. That means this mistaken belief that human life depends on matter, depends on my physical body, depends on that. So all these misconceptions that secular science constantly tries to convince us of, we have to question them and we have to verify that things are actually different. That is the process of dissolving. As mentioned before, with these 3 principles, the higher consciousness also has to play its part, so that these patterns can be changed in the subconscious through self-awareness. That means these 3 fundamental principles really have to work together in harmony in order for these important changes to actually take place. And in fact, let's call it this somewhat contradictory example. The ego identification with the body simply cannot by itself free itself. That is something impossible because it is part of the illusion, part of this false identification. As explained earlier, people identify with suffering, with their childhood, with their parents, and all these memories that are in the past and are now just history for us. That means by identifying with stories, we identify with illusions, and it doesn't matter whether they are true or false, because our interpretation and our emotional attachment turn them into reality for us. And this has a constant effect on our lives. In other words, it is part of this illusory perception, and for that, a higher power is needed. And in this respect, alchemy is no different from other spiritual paths, quite the opposite, in fact. Without this higher power and guidance, no transformation is possible. This is also the reason why, for example, alchemical writings speak so much about prayers and similar practices. In other words, this act of rising up and connecting to the higher, without that, it doesn't work. That means the work is accomplished from above, not from below. It doesn't work any other way. So we cannot bring about these changes from below. And on this path, there are various stages. For example, in purification, it might involve cleansing the emotions or habitual patterns of thought as part of this work. Emotions. Yes, we all know them and can feel them. Hatred, prejudice, greed, envy, jealousy, arrogance. Yes, the list is almost truly endless. We are all too familiar with all these traits. We can feel all these emotions. And now we have to decide, Do we want to be slaves to these emotions, or do we want to master them? Someone who feels past hatred and keeps rekindling that hatred within themselves is a slave to hatred. No one else has anything to do with it. It is a person's own decision to feel hatred and to be tormented by their own hatred. Life doesn't need anyone on the outside to send us someone to punish us. We punish ourselves. We are both judge and executioner simply through our own feelings. That means this is the process of purification and clarification, even on the level of emotions. And here we see, okay, that's already quite a task. Then there are the thoughts. Yes, when it comes to thoughts, all those destructive associations are part of it.
2001.
On the one hand, there's the revival of past memories. On the other, the false interpretations of our world, destructive images of worry. All of these can be reflected on the level of thought and on the alchemical path. They not only belong there, but can also be purified. Then there are the habits. That means there are so many destructive habits that we can overcome. From vice, we gradually turn them into virtue. Negative habits such as various addictions, smoking, drinking too much alcohol, using drugs, or binge eating, that is, or even laziness as a repeated behavior, a kind of inertia. There is a whole range of habits that can harm us, that can hurt ourselves. They don't hurt other people, they hurt ourselves, preventing us from being free and happy. That means, yes, at this stage, this is the third level. We can also purify behavioral patterns. And of course, this is also a path of correction. Correction is a term we find in Kabbalah. This means that the nature of our being is refined, corrected, also in terms of evolution, correction, and recreation. And the goal is not just realization, but consciously applying it in everyday life. That is what alchemy is all about. Alchemy is not a theory that we just hear once and say, good idea, now I just need to change my thoughts. No, it means that we start with practice and then continuously apply it in our daily lives until change actually happens. It's also not enough to just bring a goal into our awareness once and say, I want to achieve this or that, and then just go on as before. No, in order to reach this goal, we have to let go of the old. Remove all the obstacles we have that prevent us from manifesting this goal, take the necessary steps, and then gradually make the changes so that we can develop ourselves toward this goal. That means in order to achieve a goal, we have to change ourselves to become the goal. And it's the same in alchemy. And this transformation can only happen if we let go of the old. And as an image, even a plant must wither so that new seeds can sprout. In the same way, consciousness must dissolve old structures before any new, higher level can even begin to take shape. And the path begins with self-analysis. That is not the goal, but that is where the path begins. That is not yet the spiritual path, but that is where the path begins. It has to start somewhere for us. And that means becoming aware of ourselves, our blockages, the entrenched thoughts, emotions, and behavioral patterns. And there we can really, without even needing anyone to help us, already take the first step of solvo and coagula in our lives. Right today, so right after the retreat, we could start thinking, which thoughts are negative? Which behavioral patterns should I change? Which emotions are harmful to me? And just like that, we are right in the middle of the path of alchemy, and the next step must then follow.
What role does fire play in alchemy, and why is it the key to transformation?
Fire is one of the milestones of evolution. Let's look at history. Fire is responsible for the fact that as humans, we distinguish ourselves from the collective animal in the earlier stages. The mastery of fire on the external material level. But it's not just this fire, there is also an inner fire. But fire is also responsible for the fact that life can exist at all. Because sunlight and our sun itself is a fire. Yes, it's a celestial body like fire. That means, yes, and this fire of the sun makes life possible in this solar system. Without the sun, there would be no life on Earth. It's always nice to think, it's just the necessary conditions here on Earth. No, the first prerequisite is the sun. That is the fire. If the fire of the sun is missing, there is no life here. So that means we need to become aware of the importance of fire. and not just on the material level, but also on the metaphysical level, because fire is also a symbol of aspiration. Or fire can also break down forms in various ways in the practice of alchemy, and of course in human history and in cults as well. It's no coincidence that there are certain cults and religions where there is a fire burial, and also the important step where humans began to heat their food in order to make it more digestible. This too is what truly distinguishes humans from animals. That is, humans are able to cook their food. That is what sets humans apart from animals. An animal does not cook its food. Every alchemical work begins with the phase of burning or decomposition, and the old self is destroyed. That is like fire. A symbol for this is also the phoenix, which rises from the ashes so that something higher can emerge. And let's name a phase of alchemy to give a brief insight. There is calcination. That means this is a phase of alchemy, and it is the first step in which the old is decomposed by fire, and in the end, both in the alchemical process and on the physical level, something like lime remains when everything else, that is, a white lime remains when everything else is burned away. And fire is also a powerful symbol of the divine will. It separates the pure from the impure. It stands for purification, for testing. That is, that's where the term trial by fire comes from. And you can also sense that a trial by fire is not necessarily particularly pleasant, but it is a necessary step for change. Then there is the inner fire as the driving force of transformation. And the highest level of fire is the fire of evolution and the fire of initiation. And just a very brief concluding sentence: alchemy is the blueprint for mystery schools, especially for Western mystery schools that preserve a ritual initiatory path. Because a temple ritual is essentially a symbolic, material representation of alchemical principles. That means that what takes place in an initiatory ritual are symbols in motion, representing an alchemical process that is absorbed into the consciousness of the candidate. In other words, it is an alchemical process that is being depicted.